Okay.
Thank you, Mary.
All set?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm thinking about the non-Indigenous people and their reactions, that how you feel that when you do the builds. I mean, in a way, that's kind of, to me, that's kind of healing too, because in a way it's sort of connecting us with a sense of what Canada is that we didn't really think about before.
Right. Well, that's something else I notice is it connects us as people in the sense that the canoe being an iconic symbol. I mean, there are all shapes and sizes of canoes now. But once you tell them that this vessel that you see in front of you is all stems back to this original canoe or this original vessel, and then it kind of makes a connection with them. Even if you're new to Canada or to North America, you've seen a canoe or you've ridden in a canoe somewhere, and once you're out on the waters, it's so peaceful and serene. And once you enlighten them as to this is the original vessel, and it blows their mind. They can't believe that something so beautiful comes from nature in the sense of like harvesting raw material and taking that. And then another metaphor that I use is once all the material was prepped, a lot of it was flimsy. And once they're back together, they're solid and just like people. What's that saying? United we stand, divided we fall. And so the more we can come together as one, that makes us real strong as people. And our prophecies, the Seven Fires prophecy, tells us of a time in the seventh fire, which they say is now, and that we have to come together in order for our species to survive. And so this is why I think canoe builds, whether it's in Indigenous territories or non-Indigenous, is important. It connects us. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the lateral violence. I mean, maybe you don't feel comfortable talking about it, but
I'm not.
Any suggestions for people, because there was this, I don't think I sent it to you, a really good video by this Isaac Murdoch talking about how the oppressed become the oppressors. And I mean, maybe the need for Indigenous peoples to kind of just let go, or how do you see Indigenous peoples coming together in the seventh fire as well as the non-Indigenous?
Well, I've said that recently. Says we've been oppressed so long, or racist bond so long. I feel that we've become one of the biggest racists out there now. That's a result of being oppressed for so long. And as far as us getting over this lateral violence, we're not exactly sure. Maybe our role models, who are our chiefs, should initiate these steps. Because when I go back home, that's all I hear about is white people this, white people that, or French people this, French people that. Well, until you've experienced life on the outside, that's all you're gonna hear. And you hear it enough times, then you start to believe it. And I know there is racism on the outside, systemic racism, as they would call it today. But for the most part, I think the governments are trying to do their best. In our situation, I remember 25 years ago, we had the AFN chief who was Matthew Kuncombe. He called out the chiefs on that very thing right there. And not only that, it was like addictions. And then he said, you guys are role models. You should be setting an example and making programs around this. And first thing you know, he was voted out. Why? Because he hit a nerve. And, and when I think back on it, he was right, But until we can change that colonial system, will things change? We don't know. But I know through the canoe, that gets people to focus on reconciliation, whether it's reconciling with cultures within yourself, with the land, you know. And that's what I see, you know. Yeah.
Okay, well, your grandfather is a pretty famous person.
Yes.
And so, I mean, people change over time, and when people are teenagers, they're not elders. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about growing up with your grandmother and your grandfather and what they were like at that point and how they changed and how your grandfather came to the realizations that he did later on in his life.
Well, I can only tell you what I experienced with them growing up. Because, like I said, at 20 years old, I left the town. I left Maniwaki. It was always Ottawa, Maniwaki, Ottawa, Maniwaki. And so, but my grandfather was a fierce, fierce spokesperson for Native rights all throughout my childhood. You know, he helped found the American Indian movement in Canada, along with an indigenous fella from the Wendat people, and that would be the Hurons. And together they challenged governments. And then you have my grandmother. My grandmother was very spiritual, but she was also a very devout Roman Catholic. But what I remember about her is we'd go and harvest material, or we'd harvest food to eat. She'd always leave shiny coins behind. And that was to pay respect for Mother Earth, but also to pay respect for the little people. And the little people, we have to honor them too, right? And then as time went on and I got older, I came to realize that many, many cultures share that legend, you know. I know, like in the East Coast, they have Mugladmuj, and that's what they call them. Us, it's Pigujinini, the Algonquin people. I guess in the UK would be the fairies and the leprechauns. And so that's just four. And I'm sure there are other cultures that have these legends. Yeah. And so this is what I experienced growing up with them. But that came to an end there at 20 years old when I figured, you know, life was better away from the reserve and just to return to it. But by then my grandmother had passed. But I still can feel her presence every time I do what I'm doing. My grandfather has passed too, but he's the one that encouraged me to get back into it, you know, hoping to pass on that family tradition. And right before his passing, I knew he had founded the Circle of All Nations, and that was, I guess, a group of all nations that would come together and pray collectively. And every August, then he'd have some kind of gathering at his place back home. And you'd have all kind of people come in, like from Japan, China, Brazil, you know, even Australia. You'd have the Aborigines. They'd all come and pray collectively for Mother Earth, you know. That when she does finally decide enough is enough, that she won't take all of us, you know. Because the prophecy does say in the seventh fire that we're going to, as people, we have to put our differences aside and come together as one, and then form the mightiest race of all, the human race. And so, if we don't, then she's gonna heal herself, whether we're on board or not, you know. And then the legend says that if we don't choose wisely, there'll be great calamity. And so, is this part of the COVID thing today? We don't know, you know. And from what I'm hearing anyways, it was something that was made in the lab. If it was made naturally, then it would play along with the legends. But I mean, you look all around us, you know, we're just treating the land very, very badly. Yeah, and so this is what I experienced growing up, and then in the later years of my life, up to now. Yeah. And one thing I find funny is when I started canoe making, I didn't want to go down that path that my grandfather had laid before us. For some reason, more and more, I'm being led down that path. You know, and I don't think of myself as a very experienced knowledge keeper. You know, I only tell what I remember. You know, and what I read about him, and And for instance, they decided to name the one of the bridges after him in Ottawa. And when somebody asked me, does that make you happy? I said, yeah, well, yeah, it's an acknowledgement, but I could feel his sadness on the other side. And the reason why I feel sadness is because they won't realize his dream, which was that island that's right on the border of Quebec and Ontario, Victoria Island. His vision was to have a healing center there, and for all Indigenous peoples of Canada, but also it was to serve as a meeting place for young people, not only Indigenous. It was for all cultures. And so when they get off the plane or they get off the train or the bus, you don't have these vultures there preying on them. They'd have someplace safe to go and learn about, let's say, city life, you know. So they haven't realized his vision, so I can feel that sadness on the other side. Yeah, and so here we are today. I've pretty well given up trying to fight for it. And because when I thought about it, I'm fighting big corporation, you know, with billions and billions of dollars. And so, yeah, it'll happen. If it happens, it happens. If not, it won't, you know. Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe, you know, it's so touching. Maybe you could just talk about a few, maybe one or two experiences of coming together in the canoe build that really stand out for you. I don't want to put anybody, you know, there's not consent on the part of the other person.
Yeah.
You know, don't need to be that specific.
Well, I have many, but the most memorable would have been my canoe build at the Canadian Canoe Museum in Peterborough. I guess for the simple fact that my grandparents were great friends with the founder, Kirk Whipper, and they had 2 canoes on display. I didn't know they had another 2 in their storage facility. And so I remember working on the one that's the most photographed canoe in the world, apparently. And so every day they'd have Skype programs with different schools all throughout North America, not just Canada. You know, I was talking to kids from Texas. And then we're walking through, and then they'd stop at the canoe that I helped work on. And then they'd ask questions about the material and if it's sustainable. You know, these are amazing questions from kids. And so we talk about that kind of stuff, and then, you know, what we're trying to accomplish. Like I said, always keeping the next 7 generations in mind, and only take what you need. And that's what stood out in my mind. But then you'd have all these people that would come through the museum, and they'd always stop at the canoe build. And they were just so fascinated, you know. Once again, it's like taking these raw materials and turning it into something that's workable, and it's a thing of beauty. And then another thing that stands out in my mind is each time I go into a school, is you get the odd kid who's not proud or happy to self-identify. And then through the canoe, they self-identify. I remember one in Stittsville, just outside Ottawa. The kid was from BC, his bloodline, Haida. And then he came by the canoe, I guess it just drew him there, and then he started working with us. And first thing you know, he says, "Oh, I'm Haida. Did you know that?" No. I go, "No." So there he's going around telling everybody he's Haida. And then in the same school board, now we're in south of Ottawa. This was a non-Indigenous kid, but he was clashing with the principal, knocking heads steady, you know. And then the principal, being an avid canoer, the kid was so interested in the canoe build, he'd show up every day, you know. And then I took it on myself, to, you know, engage him on a almost daily basis. And then he turned out to be my main helper. So at the end, him and the principal now are buddies through the canoe. Yeah, so these, you know, it's not one specific canoe build. Well, you take like here last summer, I've seen the healing through the women, with the women, you know, and that's one thing that we've come to understand about the canoe build. It wasn't just a male thing, it was a male and female. And it just makes a lot of sense. because you had the young male growing up learning canoe, and you had the young female growing up learning about the canoe. And when they met, they possessed that knowledge, and they had to make the canoe their family vehicle. Yeah, and so what we had here last year was like, what, 80-90% women were helping, and this just was one of those proud moments, you know. And that is, it's too bad there were more males, and we'd be able to heal each other, you know. But I mean, it is what it is. And then I found that not only did I heal, you know, from my past, it was a pretty checkered past, especially during my drug abuse years. Yeah, and I really took advantage and hurt a lot of people. So that's my way of healing as well. But I noticed a lot of women heal too. And, you know, like you take Corona and Lumina, and they were very proud to be indigenous, you know. And then they're going out and they're exploring the woods, looking for bark and that kind of stuff. Every day they'd show up when they could. You got Michelle here, you know, coming out every day. You were here every day. So it didn't really matter what culture you were from. It's just the fact that, you know, the women are out here doing it. And that was a proud moment.
So can you just talk a little bit about, you know, people talk about the matriarchal society.
Right.
And I just saw a thing on Facebook where somebody said, well, the problem is that men, when they think about a matriarchal society, they think the women are in control, and then they get angry. So that's not really what a matriarchal society is. So I wonder if you can just explain, having grown up in a matriarchal society, how that...
Well, you have to look at the medicine wheel first. They say there's 4 levels or 4 stages or sections of the medicine wheel, and the child is in the center. And then the first circle around the center, which is the children, are the elders. And that's the knowledge keepers that pass that on to the kids. Then it's the women. And the women, they had important roles. And then on the outside was the males. And the males were the protectors, the warriors. Yeah. And so in a matriarchal society, what I was taught was all it is if I was to meet you and you're, let's say you're Micmac and I'm Algonquin, well, I have to go and live on your community. And that's all it was. And there was, they say that the women held a high importance. Well, that is true. But it was a balance thing too, right? And equality was a big thing. And without that balance, then, I mean, and that's where the conflict starts. And so we're just starting to relearn that knowledge again, you know. Yeah, and there you have it. I wish I can go into it more, but like I said, we're just getting back in touch with that part of us that we lost.
Did it feel when you were growing up that it was actually that men and women were equal to one another?
No.
Or did it feel like the men were in charge because that was what Christianity did?
That's right, when that colonial system started. And that's where we started to drift away from that. Yeah, and then like you had mentioned, when the women finally spoke up, and the males would get mad, you know, and then anger came in. And anger leads to the dark side. And getting back to, or not getting back to, but mentioning the 7 sacred teachings. In our culture, the first one is love. And because without love, then there's no forgiveness, you know. And so we built off of that. And then it goes through all the stages. And the last one I like is the truth. And you can't know truth if you don't know the 6 before it. Yeah, and so we're kind of relearning that. But I found the kids on the reserve, they're just well, back home anyways. I'll use my home, and they're just starting to get back into that, you know. And here we are today.
Okay, so you've talked about the canoe as being the family car.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that a bit? Because I thought that was
Yeah. Well, without that vessel, without that knowledge, I mean, you weren't going anywhere, or you were walking. What we know now is Victoria Island was a great sacred area. Every year, from what I understood, those people coming from all over North America would make that journey, and they'd go there and they'd pray collectively. And it was believed that the kettle there, which is rapids, I suppose, when it came off the Horseshoe Falls, it went into the calmer part, but then there was churning of the water and it was like smoke. And they believed there was a big sacred pipe in there. And then the more churning in the water, the more smoke it would produce. And so they felt that was a sacred spot. So every year they'd make that long trek. Now, if you didn't have a canoe, either you didn't make it, you'd have to leave earlier, or you were walking. Yeah, so that was the importance of the canoe. We're not exactly sure when we made that transition to birch bark. And as I mentioned to somebody recently, there is evidence that it could be 3,500, 4,000 years ago. And why and how they came up with, that birch bark stuff, we don't know. Maybe there were scrolls, but they're all rotted and, biodegraded back into the ground. And there is at the Canoe Museum, if you've never been there, it'd be a place to go. But they do have an Algonquin dugout canoe. Thing with that, though, excuse me, is wood logs per se is when they're dry, they tend to crack. And then with a dugout, because you're only looking at maybe that much support around the log, when it cracks, it opens up, and your canoe's leaking now. So in order to avoid that, you have to leave it submerged, and it swells up, and then it blocks the cracks. So you can imagine a log 12 feet long, let's say 20-inch diameter, must weigh maybe half a ton, So try carrying that through the woods. Also, too, what I found out recently is, we're not exactly sure when that started, but let's say you got off on a certain lake and you had to cross land to get to the other lake. You left the canoe that you were on, you left it there. And then you walked to a specific spot and there was another canoe waiting for you there. And so apparently these were all over in the woods, especially in Algonquin territory. Probably on the East Coast too, where canoe making was huge. And I guess over time they would just rot and, so here we are today.
Okay, well, I think I've asked everything that I can think of. Do you have the question that you'd like to ask Michelle?
There's a few things that were kind of coming up a little bit with what you were talking about. Anyways, I was kind of wondering, in terms of just what you were speaking about right now, was that the Iroquois had their bark canoes, elm bark and that, and they really liked the birch bark because it was better and lighter and whatever.
Yeah.
And so with the competition between the different nations over furs or this or that or the other, they probably you couldn't rely on your canoe being where you left it.
Well, see, now that was, from what I understand, I was talking with a Mohawk elder, and there was a mutual understanding. But then I heard somewhere else that there was raids, and then they'd steal them or they'd trade for them. Yeah. And then we know that the Mohawks were from a different area where there was no birch bark. Yeah.
Or not enough.
Or not enough.
Or not big enough.
Yeah. But then you take like the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy, who were from the New England states, and they made canoes too. And so that kind of leads you to wonder where exactly was the Iroquois nation situated then. And because you can go as far south, I don't know, as I know in Wisconsin they were making birch bark canoes, the Ojibwe people there. Now there must have been a section of land where there was no birch bark anymore.
Where there was
No more birch bark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there, from some of the research that I was reading into some books and stuff, that there was a big trade in birch bark
Yes.
before Hudson Bay Company.
Yeah. Before contact.
They used to trade.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then with the Hudson Bay Company and stuff, there were certain places where there was like stockpiles of birch bark.
Yeah, and then that's what I learned there recently is you'd come upon a log shack in the middle of nowhere, inside it'd be full of birch bark, and that was the Hudson Bay Company and the fur traders, I suppose, that were doing that.
And maybe they were trading, or maybe they had it there for repairs on their canoes.
Well, there's word that maybe they didn't want us having it,
Or that too.
and
Or the thing is they have the voyageur, right?
yeah,
But then they have the Cours de Bois, and the Cours de Bois were the free men
yeah,
who weren't connected to Hudson Bay, and there was a competition to squeeze them out.
yeah, yeah.
They were stockpiling.
Yeah, because we're not exactly sure on our part, anyways, because we didn't really have a written history, right? And if we did, then it was put on birch bark scrolls.
Yeah.
And if it's not,
Scrolls went west.
well, whatever one survived.
Yeah, whatever one survived.
Yeah.
They went west.
Yeah,
And so, from my understanding, what I was told was we had decided to stay east
yeah,
and slow the progression west. And so the migration with the Anishinaabe people
yeah.
and the scrolls and whatever went west.
Okay, Chuck, so we want to talk about the canoe as healing. And I think we're just going to ramble a bit and just go wherever
Okay.
the conversation takes us. But I know you feel strongly about this, and maybe you could just talk about that a little bit.
Well, as far as healing is concerned, not sure about other cultures. But healing and for Indigenous people, especially the Anishinaabe people, it's healing in the sense that when I lived on the reserve and when I do visit reserves, you feel that especially in the young people, is that feeling of despair. And like myself, anyways, I'll use myself as proof, I suppose. Is I always question, why am I here? What am I supposed to do here? And going to school and learning history that wasn't ours to begin with, and then all of a sudden you're exposed to it. But through the canoe, birch bark canoe especially, then you start to feel that historical connection. And to me it was healing. And that feeling of despair slowly dissipated or disappeared. And I feel that now when I go around to Native communities. I have that feeling that not only are they not feeling the despair anymore, it's a feeling of pride, and then when I connected too, like historically, if it weren't for the birch bark canoe, probably the explorers would have come in eventually, but it allowed them to come in quicker and colonize the country, and so we have that, at least that pride of knowing if it weren't for the birch bark canoe, Canada would be Canada eventually, but not as quick as we had thought.
Well, and maybe not. Maybe it would be America.
Maybe it would have been America, or as my grandfather says, we would have eventually get to this, but at a slower pace and in more of a sustainable way, and then we would have always taken into account the next 7 generations before us that have yet to come. And so I think this is a real healing vessel. And I notice now more and more Native people, and they want to bring that back. Yeah, and this is why I think it's important.
So you found it, how old were you when you, came to that kind of understanding. Because, I
Oh,
mean, that kind
jeez.
of understanding about who are you and where are you,
Yeah.
it takes a long time.
Well, I suppose it would have started, but I really didn't pay attention when I was a kid growing up and learning. And as I previously mentioned, I left that go about 20 years old, thinking that there was something better out there. Just to return 20, 25 years later. At first, I didn't get that feeling, but the more I did it, and the more Indigenous people were crying, I suppose, for that, you know. And then the more I did with them, the more I start to sense that in me. And then because of that gift that I suppose that I was trying to shun all these years, I start accepting that. And the message that I get are keep doing what you're doing, or build them and they'll come. Yeah, just like the Field of Dreams, build it and they will come.
So
And,
how old were you when that
oh,
you
geez,
began doing it?
I figure around 50. Yeah, so 10 years have gone by, but I've been doing this now 13 years. Yeah, so for the first 3 years, it's just to survive, more or less. You know, I could have had the odd job here and there, but it didn't seem right to me. And then when I took on this responsibility, I'm thinking to myself, well, you look around, nature is pretty well decimated, you know. How am I going to keep this up? What am I going to do? And then slowly by slowly, the messages start coming through, and then working with the governments like M&R, Bancroft Minden Forestry Authority. There's the Lanark Mazana Forestry Agency, them too. And we go to meetings with them, and then we kind of teach them, you know, some sort of Indigenous law when it came to natural law too. And don't take more than you need. Protect this species, protect that species. And so slowly by slowly, we're getting through to them finally. And then in turn, they're helping us. Yeah, I guess they're helping me. Yeah.
So tell us a bit about.
We just 1 second.
In that we kept our ways, connection to the land a lot longer. And then the Celts like us were forbidden from doing their ceremonies, you know. Yeah. And just like over here, at some point then we were outlawed from doing that, you know. And I seen a modern film, it's called Rumble, The Indians That Rocked the World. I don't know if you ever seen that. And then they were saying at some point in, I think it was late 1800s, early 1900s, where it was forbidden for a native person to have a drum. And if he was seen with a drum, he was shot on sight, or she was shot on sight. Yeah, because they didn't want us doing our ceremonies. And then a lot of blacks, they mingle with the native people, and that's how that culture kept going on. Yeah. Yeah, for instance, Jimi Hendrix was apparently half Cherokee. Yeah, and that I didn't know. That's just eye-opening, that movie. But that's mean that we're finding more and more about our history, you know, as time goes on, and it makes me proud. Yeah, you know. And if we can do more things like, you know, not only the canoe, but, well, I did a wigwam last spring. I mean, the people that come by the place where I was doing it there, it's like that blew them completely away. And I says, the only reason why it's this size is because it has to fit in the truck. But if you can imagine these elaborate friggin' wigwams, or they call it picogun. Yeah. And I mean, they could have been like 100 feet wide, you know, or the circumference, or the radius, or the diameter. And
It's interesting that they're starting to speak about it more in my nation, that we're longhouse people.
Yeah.
But because of contact and how much decimation with disease, that we switched to a little wigwam.
Yeah.
You know, and the bark as opposed to the skin and stuff. And then, you know, you're probably having trouble with, you know, resources to make housing and whatever too.
Yeah, yeah.
With contact. But, you know, we you'd have a council meeting of some kind, you'd need something big. And, you know, the technology for that even, you know, if you go from a sweat lodge into a pico-gun, into a longhouse, into, like, the technology evolves.
Yeah. Well, apparently we tried living in large, groups, and like over 100,000 people in a group.
Oh, that's really big.
Yeah, and apparently, even though they got ready for it, a lot of people ended up dying from starvation. And that's when they realized that we can't live in large groups like in these cities.
It's sustainable.
Yeah. And so one thing lucky about the large groups is they can just go and buy food now. But at some point that's going to run out, right? Yeah. And I guess that's why, like I know in our people, and the large group was like around the Oka. And then the families, they dissipated from there. They went out every so often, right? And they lived, they take like up in Bancroft, Nipissing Lake. And it was one group there, and then a little further south. And then all sprouted throughout the territory. Yeah, and not in very large groups. Yeah. And I guess we had already learned that. Yeah. And so when you look throughout North America, and that's the way it was.
Well, down in South America, they talk about, you know, the Aztec or this or that or the other and what happened. And sooner or later you get too large.
Yeah.
And it's not sustainable.
Well, I'm thinking there was something.
They ended up being fairly large because they, you know, they had corn and they had this or that or the other, and they had their big networks of trade.
Yeah.
Their laborers bringing this stuff in from outside of the city.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, for the most part.
situation up here, so.
Anyhow,
Yeah, you
Sure.
Get in.
get on your way.
Yeah, I don't want to hold you up. Before you go, I was wondering if maybe you could give us a greeting in your native.
I can't talk my language. I can't speak my language. No, we lost that. My parents lost that. If I could, I would.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you.
He's bilingual. He's got French and English.
Yeah. The two dominant languages. Because for a while there wasn't cool to speak the Algonquin language.
Right.
Yeah.
It wasn't cool amongst the Algonquin.
No, well,
Because the
for,
residential school said that they weren't allowed to.
well, for the most part, yeah. Like my parents and them, they went to Indian day school, and if they were caught talking their language, they were beaten. But then they'd go home at night, and that's all there was. But you couldn't speak it outside. And I know people up like in the Bancroft area. I mean, they were shamed to the point where they had to go and hide. They'd go and hide. They'd run away from the Indian agents, you know. And just 20 years ago, they started re-embracing that again. But there, the language is totally gone. And same thing with us. And if you think about it, the majority of Indigenous folk across the country are in the same boat. I guess the ones that weren't exposed to it, as further west you go, right? Because the contact wasn't right away. Then they start holding on to their language. The only Algonquins I know are Barrier Lake and a little further up, because they were away from that wave of French. Yeah, but in Ontario, the Algonquins, none of them speak the language.
Well, there's a couple in Golden Lake.
Yeah, Barry Sarrazin.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but I don't know what it's like on their reserve. You know, whether it's only like his family.
that's only him and his wife, as far as I know. And then there was so much intermingling with the Irish. I mean, you got blonde-haired, blue-eyed, fair-skinned native people with full status cards. You know, but that's just the way it is.
That was the plan of the government, though. That was the plan. They wanted to eradicate it, and they wanted to eradicate the influence of the culture as well. And so when they did, I don't know if you've heard of Bill C-31. but before Bill C-31, if a Native woman married
A
a
non
white man, she lost her status and her rights to be on the reserve
and all her kids.
to have support. And so my ex-partner, this happened to his mother, and the man walked away and left her with these children, and welfare would not help her because she was Indigenous, but the First Nation would not help her and could not help her because she had married a white man. And so she ended up with a minister of a church who set her up in an abandoned house and then came by with some white people who said, I'll take that one, and that one. They're whiter than the rest. And they went off and adopted out with their children.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a pretty sad history, but
But this is sort of what happened, right? And then if a Native man married a white woman, she was allowed to live on the reserve because she would be the one who would be teaching all the white ways to the children.
gained full status.
She would gain status.
When the reservation system came in,
Yeah.
she'd gain
She
full
would gain
status.
So she would be allowed to live on the reserve, but they were expecting and hoping that she would
Teach.
colonize the children away from their Indigenous culture.
And for a while, what started happening to is when that happened, and the woman would get rid of the native husband and bring in a non-Indigenous, and so then they start living like you said. We'll teach or we'll get rid of that native part of you. Yeah.
And so then what they ended up doing was they did the Bill C-31 and she got reinstated. And maybe her children got reinstated.
I think it was the
They
first.
They started adding for everybody. Didn't matter if you were a man or woman or whatever. A double mother clause and second generation cutoff and all this kind of thing. And so these women got let in, but now everybody's getting kicked out. And they're essentially doing a blood quantum, but they're not calling it that.
Well, one thing I found out about blood quantum too is they can't exactly tell which people you're from. They can only, because of that chromosome or gene in the DNA test, they can only identify you as Indigenous.
Okay.
They can't tell if you're from the West Coast.
Which one, but they aren't here. They're not doing blood. Like, I don't know if the blood quantum in the United States is they're actually testing your blood,
Yeah.
or whether they are calculating out percentages like they are here
Yeah.
in terms of what they expect and assume.
Yeah.
But what ends up happening here is that you'll have someone who's from a different nation marrying someone else from a different nation, but they don't have enough blood quantum for one of the nations to have their status, but they're still carrying all this Indigenous.
Yeah, because when I was out there Monday, when I went up to get Cedar, my friend Stephen, he was in the meeting and they were talking about that.
Okay.
Yeah, how can you do DNA tests when the results are always this?
Yeah.
And then one came up with an example of some stupid system, and I guess the company that's doing the DNA testing, he said he took a swab from his German Shepherd
Oh yeah.
and sent it in, and apparently it came up that he was 45% Indigenous.
Isn't that hilarious?
The German Shepherd. I'm going, holy Christ. Yeah, so.
I don't really like the possibilities with some of that genealogy, whatever.
Yeah.
And they're only comparing it to known, tested, whatever. And anyways, the 23andMe, they'll give you your health history or whatever. That particular one, their data was bought out by a pharmaceutical company.
Yeah, that's dangerous, isn't it?
Yeah.
But theoretically, the rest of them, according to the library, doing a workshop thing on genealogy or whatever, that they can't do the health stuff off of the data.
Right.
I don't know whether they can do more testing on the sample, like how long they hang on to the sample.
Yeah, how long the sample is viable.
Yeah, I don't really know. But the thing being is that Indigenous isn't just race. Indigenous is
Culture.
a culture, but it's a way of life and a way of culture in terms of, you know, doing your Oktoberfest dance.
Yeah.
And so, but they really want to destroy. They want to remove titles and right
Right.
to the land. Is what they're wanting to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it's still going on today.
And so, you know, they've forgotten how to share.
We've forgotten how to share.
Me?
We, as
No, they.
the non-Indigenous people.
Yeah, like Western society has forgotten how to share.
Yeah.
It's their philosophy is the one who wins is the one who has the most toys.
Yeah.
You know, as opposed to ensuring that everybody. They have a problem with you know, some of the socialist type programs in terms of universal health care and this kind of thing. There's this real dichotomy between that and capitalism.
Yeah.
You know, and yeah.
Yeah, that's it, eh?
That's it. Yeah. So anyway, thank you.
Probably to do ceremony and whatever, like at Shakir Falls or
Yeah.
whatever. And you know, they wouldn't necessarily be someone maybe from every nation, but let's say I'm under the assumption that someone from the Wabanaki Confederacy was represented at 1701 treaty in Montreal.
Yeah.
Right? And so, you know, maybe someone from the Anishinaabe group or would go to
Same with the Mohawks.
yeah, would go to Winnipeg
Yeah.
for whatever was happening in terms of that, in terms of all of the
Yeah.
And so, you know, we had multiple trail routes that we used for trade, and the highways were our waterways with our canoes of various kinds.
Yeah.
And we knew of each other and traded and did whatever with each other.
That's right.
And
that.
was lucky enough to have us help them along.
That's right.
And it's interesting because when you have these discoveries, right? You know, so and so discovered, right? Like Columbus discovered, right?
Yeah.
I'll just bet he wasn't the first one off the boat. You know, he would
Yeah.
have sent somebody out
Yeah,
there
yeah,
first, right?
yeah.
See if it's safe, then I'll come down.
Yeah, yeah.
Type of thing. And so, you know, Radisson or whatever that we were talking about earlier, and that when they did their trips and stuff, they're the one that goes down in the history book as the one who discovered or who drew up the maps or did whatever.
Yeah.
But they had Indigenous people who were showing them.
Yeah.
Indigenous people who were taking them, like Secretary.
Yeah. Well, for instance, Champlain going up the Ottawa River, and like you said, he must have sent a delegate first, and see what kind of people he's dealing with.
Yeah, you know, his might not have been the first boat.
That's
on
right.
The line, and he wasn't the first one to step out.
Yeah.
And so there's one book that I would like to see.
Yeah.
And we're in an alliance. There was fighting and whatever before, but we're in an alliance with the Iroquois Confederacy through Ganawagi. And so we that we would take with us when we went, like a representative of the Wabanaki Confessor Confederacy would go to Kahnawake. And the Ottawa are the grandfather or whatever of this treaty alliance. Like they're kind of like the referee between what goes on with this treaty.
Yeah.
And so I don't know where all the treaty belts and stuff have gone for some of them.
Well, they say they're in Europe.
Or they could be in some of these museums, or who knows.
Well, that's what they're saying, especially in like in Spain, England, and I think France.
And then the other thing I heard of was at Six Nations. Well, supposedly there's a chest that was made to house these wampum belts that were at Kahnawake. And so I don't know what's necessarily happening with that. And then there was supposed to be some belts that were at Six Nations, and they were stolen by the government that came in.
Right.
And so, but under my understanding is anytime there was a new one or you annually feast these belts
Yeah.
and renew the relationships again, that the previous agreements and things would have come up again in the discussion.
Yeah.
The belts would have been transferred across the fire. And so that understanding of two-row line.
Okay. May 26th, I think. Okay, I just opened it up a third of the stop, and it looks like perfect exposure. And I'm going to do it once more. Just for the fun of it. Slow. Whoops. No, we're good. This track is a lot narrower. This shot is probably going to be the keeper shot. Slow. Kind of a bum bang. Do it once more, hopefully. And here we go. That's a beauty. I think that's a good one. Good 10 seconds there. 8 seconds.